on that final point, we've seen some amendments that would counter that and would attack souls to the polls hours today. Can we take from your dialogue you just had that you will oppose any amendment that would restrict the hours of souls to the polls?
So may I provide a little background information and context for our colleagues that are listening? So in the legislation that you have before us today, it expands the hours from 5 hours to a minimum of 6 hours on Sundays. There's a Sunday in between the 2 weeks of early voting. And it also puts a start time of 9 a.m. and an end time of 10 p.m. for the local jurisdiction to determine when the best hours would be. And I provide that for
context. I just want to make sure you will oppose any amendment that would raise that start time on a Sunday to, let's say, noon, as we've seen amendments filed to that today.
I believe that a start time of 9 a.m. and an end time of 10 p.m. with flexibility of local jurisdiction, as crafted before you today, is the best policy for us to consider.
Let me ask a couple quick questions. I know we got limited time. Under current law, local counties get to decide voting hours during early voting. Are there any restrictions to those hours under current law?
Under current law, it states, for example, for many counties, that a minimum of at least 8 hours needs to be made available. For example, during weekdays.
But it doesn't set what hours those can be.
That is correct. There is not an express prohibition against more than 8 hours.
So counties can set their own hours within the 24-hour realm as they choose under current law. Does this bill take us backwards on the hours that a county can choose to serve?
No, actually, it guarantees additional hours that would be available as minimum hours.
As minimum hours. I'm talking about maximum hours.
So
right now, a county, as we've seen done, can have voting up to 24 hours during the early voting period. We've had questions from our colleague. Does this bill, what are the parameters in this bill for during early voting for hours that can be voted?
So, and you've got several points that you make there. Let me try to address one, and if I didn't answer correctly, please ask me again. You mentioned about the 24 hours. I'll point out, and Representative Bucy, as a member of the committee that heard this legislation both during the first and the second called session, that you heard resource witnesses from the Texas Secretary of State explain that the concept of 24-hour voting, or more than the 8 hours that was minimally required under current statute, is what was a novel idea that was applied by a jurisdiction during the 2020 pandemic, but has not happened in the past across the state.
But it's allowed under current law to do so.
It is not prohibited under current law.
So we've had people have access to 24-hour voting, and this bill will do what to those hours? What are the parameters?
This bill prescribes a start time and an end time during the early voting period, which is 2 weeks and the weekend in between.
Well, and I appreciate your history because we've all heard celebration about how Texas has such early voting. My point in these questions is, under this bill, correct me if I'm wrong, the maximum amount of time allowed is 16 hours in a day for early voting. Is that correct?
For each weekday during early voting, that is correct.
16 hours. And current law allows up to 24. So we are regressing access by 1/3 of the early voting period. So as I've heard our colleagues celebrate our early voting period, it should be noted that this bill will take away 1/3 of that early voting period. I have one other question for you. One of the goals you set out is uniform and consistent across the state. What are the minimum voting hours in this state under this bill if it becomes law?
The minimum voting hours that are based in here during the weekdays would be a minimum of 9 hours with a window of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. during weekdays. On Saturdays, from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. and on Sundays from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. with minimum hours of 5 hours.
Is that true for all 254 counties?
No, sir, that is not. Current law actually prescribes a breakdown based on the population size of counties, and even a little further when jurisdictions where there is less than 1,000 registered voters. And I know that you're aware of that, because oftentimes that is based on the availability of poll workers, many of which are volunteers, and each jurisdiction has some flexibility to design in this because they are, as a state sets some guidelines for that. We also, there's some deference given to local jurisdictions to design that around the needs and wants of their local constituents.
My concern is, in a bill that's aimed to have uniformity, we're not solving that problem, and our rural voters are not being guaranteed the same minimum of access to the ballot box as our urban and suburban voters, if this bill becomes law.
I disagree with that conclusion. I don't think that we've heard witnesses in rural areas say that they have a limitation of access to the ballot box during their 2 weeks of early voting, the weekend during early voting,
I'm just
and
saying,
the election day of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.
whether we heard it or not, this law as written would have different minimum hours for our smaller counties, thus not inherently guaranteeing them the same hours of access that we give our urban and suburban counties.
Current law already prescribes that in the state of Texas.
It already prescribes that you can give smaller counties less access. I'm just saying in a bill that's designed to create uniformity, this is an area where we are missing that. So if we bring an amendment,
I would
I
assert
hope you would
that,
consider
I'm
that.
sorry.
I was saying if we bring an amendment, would you consider creating that uniformity across the board?
No, sir, I would not. I believe the bill tracks the current framework that we put in place.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Dutton, for what purpose?
would the gentleman yield?
The gentleman yield.
Yields for